In this lesson, I want to slow us down and give you the clinical language and frameworks that are often missing when we talk about sexual coercion. Many clients minimize their experiences because what happened to them didn't involve overt violence, no weapon, no visible injury, no moment they deemed bad enough. As a result, they often don't have language for what they went through or for how it's affecting them now. And many well-intended clinicians, without meaning to, end up reinforcing those beliefs. Most of us were trained in trauma models that were historically male-centered, models that emphasize physical violence as the primary pathway to traumatic stress. But that isn't what many people are actually experiencing, and it's not what clinical research tells us either. What clients are experiencing is real. It's impactful, and it often has significant effects on their nervous system, their relationships, their sense of safety, as well as their mental health. What I want you to take away from this lesson is this. Sexual coercion is a form of sexual violence rooted in threats to a person's safety and well-being. Sexual coercion can activate the same survival mechanisms associated with physical threat. It can create a sense of terror and has serious, lasting psychological effects. When we understand these core concepts, we can validate our clients without fear of using the wrong language, minimizing their experience, or imposing beliefs on them. It allows us to intervene more effectively. Throughout this lesson, we are using clinical and research-based frameworks to understand experience and impact, not to determine the legality or criminal classification of an event. There's a common belief that coercion is a gray area, that it's vague, hard to identify, and slippery or nuanced. And to be fair, our understanding of consent, coercion, and sexual harm is shaped by historical and social context that is embedded in sexism, oppression, a male-dominated narrative, and so much more. That matters when clients are trying to make sense of their past. But in the research literature, coercion is not vague. It's defined, it's operationalized, and even validated through measures. For example, the Sexual Coercion and Intimate Relationship Scale developed by Goetz and colleagues measures coercion across 34 specific relational behaviors. That tells us something important. Coercion isn't abstract. It shows up in recognizable, patterned ways. You can find that assessment tool in your workbook. Research defines sexual coercion as the act of being physically, psychologically, financially, or otherwise forced or tricked into engaging in sexual activity. Before we simplify that definition, I want to focus on defining 3 other terms that we will be using consistently throughout this course because they matter clinically. Trauma is not defined by how violent something looks from the outside. It is defined by a person's perception of real or threatened harm. The first is trauma. It is not defined by how violent something looks from the outside. It is defined by a person's perception of real or threatened harm. 2, harm. This refers to injury, not just physical injury, but psychological, emotional, relational, sexual, social, financial, or moral injury, including the loss of agency and safety. The third definition is exposure, which simply means contact with a threatening or violating experience, whether it happened directly or indirectly. It caused the nervous system to register it as danger. But let's circle back to coercion and use a more simply put definition of it. Sexual coercion is sexual activity without free and voluntary agreement. It refers to pressuring, manipulating, or forcing someone into sexual activity without their full, unrestricted consent. And what distinguishes coercion is that it relies on non-physical tactics rather than overt force. These tactics can include verbal pressure, such as, "You don't want to make me happy? Why do you gotta be like that?" Persistent requests like, "Come on, we can do other things." Misuses of authority, like in relationships where there's a power imbalance. The exploitation of emotional, financial, or developmental vulnerability, such in marriages where one partner controls the finances. And threats can be both explicit or implied, such as threatening to end a relationship. The mantra I want you to hold on to is this: coercion is a form of sexual violence because it obtains sexual contact under duress and not through desire. In both research and clinical literature, coerced sex is explicitly understood as non-consensual, even when weapons or visible injury are not present. That naturally leads us to the next question. How are we defining consent? There are 3 simple clinical rules of consent that are helpful for both clinicians and clients to understand. I want to explain these in a way that's practical and usable and not just using clinical jargon. But they are clinically based. Consent comes down to 3 very easy to understand core principles. Rule number 1, consent requires an enthusiastic yes. Not a lukewarm yes, not a maybe, not an I guess, a clear yes, enthusiastic in both words and behavior. Rule number 2, consent is something you opt into. It's not something you have to opt out of. Consent must be asked for. It cannot be assumed. It is required that a request be made. In no other context do we assume access to someone's body as a given, and we expect them to object if they don't want it. It's the opposite. We must ask for permission for consent to be granted. Consent must be actively given, not passively revoked. This is why freeze responses are so often misunderstood as agreement. People are assuming access to a person's body is the given, and that the absence of no implies consent, and that is not the case. It requires the presence of a yes and not the absence of a no. And rule number 3, if you cannot say no, you cannot give a fully unrestricted yes. Consent cannot exist if refusal is not a viable option. We see this in situations involving power differentials. Children can't say no to adults. Employees can't say no to their boss. A dependent cannot say no to the person who controls aspects of their life. A partner cannot say no without fear if their counterpart erupts with anger and creates a scary or unsafe environment whenever they do. We also see this in cases where persistent pressure is applied. It creates a dynamic where a person no longer feels their efforts to refuse are being respected or protected. It creates a sense of powerlessness. Also, if there's an atmosphere where retaliation feels possible, consent cannot be freely given without fear of physical, emotional, or social threat. When consent is extracted under threat, what we're looking at is coercion. We actually have a robust amount of research literature providing definitions of consent, but there is yet to be one all-encompassing universal definition of it. Across studies, consent is generally defined as one's voluntary, sober, and conscious willingness to engage in a particular sexual behavior with a particular person within a particular context. This definition includes 2 components: the internal state, that felt willingness of this is something I am freely and actively choosing, and number 2, they express that agreement, both in what they say and their behaviors. For consent to be valid, it must be freely given without threat, force, pressure, or coercion. This is where people, clinicians included, often get tripped up by the age of consent, which is a very important topic that we dive deeper into in our next lesson. For now, we're discussing an adult's ability to consent. So why is there so much confusion about consent and coercion? One of the biggest sources of confusion around consent and coercion is what I call the hierarchy of trauma. Both clinicians and clients have unconsciously ranked trauma, sometimes calling it big T versus little t, which in itself is rather minimizing. We give a ranking status of higher order to things like war, childhood sexual abuse, violent assaults, and then lower down on that list other forms like violence, car accidents, natural disasters. And towards the very bottom, we place things like coercion, chronic neglect, poverty. This hierarchy is not clinically accurate and it's not helpful. Trauma is not defined by how dramatic or violent something looks from the outside. Trauma is defined by how threatened, trapped, and powerless a person felt, and how that experience reshaped their nervous system, their beliefs, their relationships, and their behaviors. The DSM defines trauma as exposure to actual or threatened death, injury, or sexual violence. Two things matter here. First, the DSM includes the term threat. It's not just actual. Second, threat is determined by a person's perception and their nervous system response, not legal proof. Threat responses are triggered when escape feels impossible, when consequences feel catastrophic, when pain is perceived or thought to be imminent, or when survivability, immediate or long-term, feels at risk. And this is one of the most important clinical points in this entire lesson. The DSM does not require a weapon. It does not require overt force be used. It does not require signs of visible injury for an experience to be considered traumatic. Threat can be implied. Threat can be contextual to different relationships. Threats can be determined based on patterns, what's happened before, what's been threatened before, what's been punished before. So if you're hearing a client describe coercion and they're saying, but it wasn't like violent or anything, which I've heard 1,000 times, this is the way to anchor yourself. Trauma is just as much about threat and powerlessness as it is about violence and injury. So we've talked about what is actual or threatened, but let's talk about these three domains. Now let's talk about the domain of death for a minute, because people kind of misunderstand it sometimes. When we hear the word death, our mind often goes to physical death, war, illness, car accidents, physical danger. But threats to survival don't only come from overt violence. They can include threats to shelter, safety, attachment, social belonging, economic survival. Humans are social mammals. We survive in groups. A human alone in the woods will die from exposure. Humans in a group in the woods are the apex predator. And even though we don't live in tribes in the way we once did, our nervous system still carries that wiring. So when a teenager believes she will lose her relationship and her entire social world if she refuses sex, that can register as an existential danger. When a dependent partner believes refusing sex will lead to abandonment, financial devastation, retaliation, or destabilization, that can register as existential danger. When someone in a coercive relationship knows that no leads to punishment, even if it's emotional punishment, humiliation, withdrawal, threats, rage, the body can register at that as danger. The brain does not distinguish between symbolic threat and literal threat once danger is perceived. Once the nervous system detects threat or inescapability, our survival system activates. That's how coercion becomes traumatic without a weapon ever involved. Coercion is often minimized because people equate injury with visible physical harm. But injury can also be emotional, psychological, relational, occupational, or financial. For example, a woman whose partner punishes her for refusing sex through anger, shame, name-calling, or restricting access to money. She's being forced to choose between compliance and harm. That is injury. The DSM names sexual violence as a form of trauma exposure, but it does not operationalize it. So when I use the term sexual violence in this course, I'm using a public health and clinical lens, not a legal one. Public health frameworks define violence as any act that results in or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering. Under that definition, we can easily deduce that coercion is violent. It can result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm and suffering, and therefore coercion is violence. Research consistently shows that PTSD rates following sexual assault, which includes coercion, are often equal to rates of PTSD for non-sexual physical assaults. From an outcomes perspective, coercion is just as harmful as physical violence. The trauma isn't just about what happened to the body. It's about what happened to choice, to safety, and agency. This is where tonic immobility or the freeze response becomes an essential concept. Freeze is an involuntary survival response that occurs when intense fear and perceived inescapability are present, conditions central to coercion. That's why clients freeze even without a weapon involved. Relational and social threats are processed by the brain as existential danger. Sexual coercion results in harm, and because it results in harm, it is a form of sexual violence even when physical force is absent. Understanding these distinctions isn't about imposing labels on clients. It's about making sense of responses that otherwise look confusing, contradictory, or minimized, and responding with accuracy, compassion, and clinical skill. In the next lesson, we're going to look at what happens when legal definitions and psychological reality don't line up, and how that mismatch shapes client meaning making and the anxiety therapists often carry in response. But before you do that, check your workbook. There's some things in there for you.